This show is brought to you by Safety FM.
Well, welcome everyone. My name's Brent Sutton. I'm from the author of the Practice of Learning Teams, and I work alongside some amazing people with my colleagues Glenys McCarthy, Brent Robinson, and also Dr. Todd Conklin. And I've been working in learning teams for probably about 8 years now. And about 2 years ago, we published the book, The Practice of Learning Teams, which was really designed as a guide to help people on their journey as they move from the world of Safety 1 to Safety 2. And more recently, I published a white paper with my co-authors, Dr. Todd Conklin and Jeffrey Lith, about everyday learning. And I'm really pleased to be here today and to support MediRisk and the wider healthcare community in understanding how learning teams in healthcare can benefit us all and take us on that journey of learning and improving. And I've been asked 5 questions today. So the first question is, why are learning teams suitable for everyday learning? Well, first of all, learning from everyday work is a key strategy for continuous improvement. Our systems, the things that we rely on, they need to be able to learn from the change that happen every day. So being able to understand what happens in our work every day allows us that capacity for the system to listen and to work out if the system can support us to be successful every day. But learning doesn't happen in a vacuum. And for people learning, particularly in that safety environment within a healthcare setting, that learning happens from between understanding the formal system, the things that are there to support us. Some of you, that might be the rules and the process and the policies, the informal systems, and those things that people have basically always done, or the things that they do to be effective and efficient in the work they do every day. And then combined with that is that daily variability of work, because no one work day is ever going to be the same. And particularly what I see in a healthcare setting is that people are dealing with what we call dynamic risks. And when I say the word dynamic risk, what I mean by that is that workers face the same hazards every single day. Those hazards are well known and the controls are well known. But dynamic risk is that the situations and with those risks then become apparent are constantly changing throughout the day. So that learning happens between that formal system, the informal part of what we rely on, plus that dynamic variability of everyday work. And we call that learning operational learning. But the problem with operational learning is that it happens by itself. And for organizations to learn from that, or to workers to learn from that, it has to be intentional. And that's the purpose of a learning team. And a learning team allows us to explore that work is imagined. That is what the organization believes, how things are being done. Workers thought, and in a healthcare setting, that's pretty much what managers or team leaders believe how things get done. Workers disclosed or workers reported, that's what workers will tell you when they're asked, versus workers done itself, which is what you see people doing in an everyday environment. And no surprise that those 4 things are different, and there is a learning opportunity that can happen throughout those 4 cycles. So the second question, which I think was really relevant, are learning teams suitable for a complex and changing work environment, which is very reflective of the healthcare industry. what I'd like to share with you is that a learning team, getting people together, that learning team allows us to see the story of complexity through the eyes of the people that face the risk every single day. I come from a risk management background, and what I find quite fascinating is that one of the main purposes of risk management is to reduce the uncertainty of risk by introducing controls, defenses, or barriers. But whatever we do, there's always some residual risk. And at some point, the organization basically says that it can do no more. And that residual risk is then left up to the workers to determine and to decide every day how that residual risk will be dealt with. What I find fascinating is that it's only workers that face the consequences or the severity of that residual risk. And secondly, whatever the organization couldn't manage, then magically it believes that workers can create their own way of solving it. And sadly, when it goes wrong, we use techniques or interventions where people end up feeling blamed. Versus a learning team, it allows us to focus on why things go right, to try and manage or reduce why things go wrong. So that whole notion of focusing about why we are successful in work, remembering that if you look at your own organization, people are far more successful than unsuccessful. By understanding success, that allows us to learn from failure. The other component, and it's very much important that what Dr. Eric Honagel talks about, is that everyday work provides the best basis for learning, whilst excellence provides the worst. What Eric is basically saying is that to really understand those things that happen, you have to look for everyday work, because you'll see those things in a much higher frequency in terms of how often that's happening. And also you'll see the similarity between the systems as well. And those are things that we call weak signals. Sadly, when an event happens, those weak signals become strong signals. And because that signal becomes strong, it becomes obvious. And that's where hindsight kicks in. Because once something becomes obvious to us, we then put in place a process of rebuilding the event rather than asking what was the decision making of that person in the system they're having to operate in at the time. But it's important for us to achieve these things that we have some core principles. And there are 5 core principles of learning team. And the first one, principle 1, is understanding that work is imagined, what the organization believes, and work is done, how workers have to work within the system every day, gives us context to risk. It's those stories, it's that narrative. And it is normal for there a gap to be between work is imagined and work is done. Principle 2 is that groups outperform individuals in problem identification and solving. What does that mean? In a learning team, we want to have lots of different people involved, because it's that diversity of the functions that people have, and also that diversity of thought, which is every person sees risk differently, that allows us to expand on that. There's also research that tells us that teams of 3 to 8 people are optimal for solving complex problems. Is there an ideal size for a learning team? Look, I think that varies, because that comes down to the capability of the facilitator. What we say to people is that when you start your journey, look for that sort of magic number of 4 to 8. When you start going past that number of people, you typically encounter more personal agendas kick into it. So if you're not an experienced facilitator, keep that number slightly smaller, that 4 to 8 number. As you become more experienced, you can widen it out in that way, or have a co-facilitator with you at the same time. Principle 3, workers have the best knowledge and understanding of the problem. We need to respect the fact that workers are the experts in their work. Those workers are having to deal with the risk that the organisation can't manage for them. We need to respect that of them. And we need to hear from them about that and about their journeys. So principle 3, we need to treat workers as the expert, and they are the key to understanding the problem. Principle 4, and this is a classic one, the more effort we put into understanding the problem, the better the solution outcome. So often today, we are fixated on fixing things. And it reminds me of Albert Einstein. He was once asked a question. If you were to solve a major world problem in under an hour, how would you do it? And his response was 55 minutes understanding it, 5 minutes to solve it. And what we find in a learning team, by really exploring and understanding the nature of the problem and clarifying the problem, it actually leads to the solution by itself. Versus, in many cases, we're simply moving, we see the problem as a notional part of an investigation, and then we move to corrective actions or fixes in that way. And principle 5 is that group problem identification, solving, and reflection drives learning and improvement. So in learning teams, we have this thing called soak time. So when you're dealing with something that is quite complex, it's important that you provide time between the first learning team and the second learning team for people to reflect and to think about what they have heard, what they have discovered, or what's been curious for them. That soak time allows people to get a deeper understanding, but more importantly, recall further information when we move into that second part of the learning team, because that second part is around clarification. The next question I was asked, can I give some examples of using a learning team? And I think that's really important. And I'd like to start that by giving you guys an example of a learning team we ran within a private hospital that provided services, including bariatric surgeries. And the organisation was quite concerned about the risks involved in lifting patients. And in particular, they had made some major investments in plant and equipment that reduced the risk of manual handling claims. Yet those claims are still occurring. Prior to running that learning team, because we're running it across the organisation, prior to running that learning team, we basically said that we wanted to go out and gather some business intelligence. We wanted to get a real pulse of what was happening out there before we engaged with a whole group of people to get deeper understanding. So we conducted a survey, and I'll share with you the results of that survey. The first thing is that survey was quite short, and because we wanted to get a better understanding about that, because we felt that what the organisation was telling us, that there was a whole culture of underreporting. So, no surprisingly, those results shared told us that 77% of workers had been exposed to that risk of patient handling and manual handling in the last 3 months, that over 40% of the workers are exposed to that risk every single day, and 81% of them believed it was a serious risk, and over 20% of people had been hurt in the last 12 months. No surprising that that information did not correlate with what the organisation knew. But more importantly, is that 79% of workers felt more could be done. What that told us was that there was a great opportunity for a learning team to occur. So we conducted those learnings, and I want to share with you what was found from that conducting of those learning teams. But when we ran those learning teams, we're really keen to separate what the organisation learnt from that process and also what workers learnt. So let's start off by finding out, what did the organisation learn? Well, no surprise, they discovered through the learning teams process and their participation that the rules that were created could not work in every single situation. So, for example, they found out that some of the rooms in some of the hospitals, that what was in the room size was never designed for. So the rooms that were built 30, 40 years ago weren't designed to handle the bed sizes for bariatric patients. And that didn't allow any space for this lifting equipment to be brought into the room. In other situations, the room itself wasn't able to support the weight of the additional lifting equipment. The second thing they learned was that the adaptive nature of people and the problem solving of people was both a strength and a weakness. They considered a weakness when someone reported something, but what was interesting is they never understood why it was a strength, because in actual fact, people were more successful than unsuccessful. And the fourth thing they learnt was that the elimination of the risk was not achievable. Therefore, their focus was on designing out the hazards in the future. That is, that when they went about refurbishing or building, that they took into account these factors, but also their focus was then about how to reduce the frequency of need of having to do this manual patient handling. So their shift was shifting away from banning having to do a manual handling to actually providing people with a better method and mechanism of understanding the risks of that, because ultimately they were the decision maker. But of course, what the workers learned was very different to what the organisation learned. And what workers shared with us through this process is that what they learned was that the need to share the stories about how, when, and why the rules didn't work. More importantly, that meant that a reporting system wasn't an effective tool for doing that. What workers also learnt is that just accepting or normalising that risk doesn't lead to any form of learning or improvement. And I think that was a key factor to underreporting, because they felt that even if they had shared it with the organisation itself, the organisation would never have made them part of the solution. The organisation would never have provided them feedback. Therefore, they felt that why would they bother to report it when in actual fact they're having to solve the problem by themselves. The third thing they learnt is that learning from why things go right supported both their mental health and well-being. Now that was really interesting, because that was unexpected from our perspective. And in the healthcare sector, a lot of people feel overwhelmed. So the fact that they were able to share those stories and they felt psychologically safe in the sharing of those stories really lifted a heavy weight or a burden. And what was interesting is that for many people, they found the learning team to be quite a restorative process for them as well. And then the last learning for those people is that they discovered that caring for themselves was an equal partner to the caring of a patient. So many people in that sector tend to always put a lot of focus about the patient and not about themselves. And through this learning team, they learned that those things were equal partners. The last component is also, what did the facilitator learn? Because when you're running a learning team, it's really important that the facilitator has time to reflect. And part of the role of being a facilitator on a learning team is to actually get both the organisation to reflect and to get workers to reflect. And it helps you to reflect. And when I say reflect, I'm really talking about reflecting on not just the process that you followed, or how the conversations went, or how the learnings went, but to ask yourself that question, what could I do differently next time? Because it's that part of continuous improvement that continues to move along. A lot of people, when they start their journey, they always say to us, well, when's it a good learning or a bad learning? How can I get better learnings? I'll share with you, learning is learning. There's no such thing as a good learning or a bad learning. There's no such thing as a number of learnings that you need. Any learning is good. In the second example, we conducted a set of learning teams to better understand a process that was being used by organisation in the construction sector, where they were having problems getting workers engaged into the management of risk in their construction sites. And we ran that learning team to understand what was the valued versus non-valued activities. The reason we did that is that if workers don't see the value in something, why would they do it? And something that is non-valued, we call it waste. And you should not allow waste to build up in your system. So we ran a learning team to understand through the eyes of the workers what they saw as being a valued and non-valued activity. In this case, it was a construction organisation. They were undertaking some publicly funded work. They had up to 11 contractors on site, nearly 1,200 workers at the peak of the contract, and the contract ran for 3 years. Their current process was very much what we call bureaucratic based. So lots of top-down compliance, lots of work processes, and you can see there on the slide that all the daily checklists simply went into a bin. In actual fact, they had collected so many daily checklists, they had to go out and hire a 40-foot container to store them. The learning team identified 2 potential wastes. The first waste was in that concept of a take 5 or a step back, which is how people kick off their process. And what we found through that learning team is that there were 2 of those done every day. It had been done over 12,000 shifts. Those things had consumed over 1,200 hours of man time, and that the cost to the organisation had been over $100,000. But these sheets of paper were simply completed and put into a box. So there was 100 grand's worth of costs, let alone the 40-foot container they had purchased. The second waste that was identified was the pre-start component. And once again, the same number of shifts, it was taking an average of 20 minutes a day, over 3,500 hours, which represented $300,000 of cost. So in total, the organisation had spent over $400,000 with these activities and had no idea what they were doing, what was the value in it. What was interesting is that in traditional safety, if there hadn't been any injuries, someone would have said, well, that 400,000 meant zero harm. Not surprisingly, accidents had occurred on the sites. So 400,000 and harm was still occurring. I don't know about you, that doesn't sound like a good return. But what was interesting is that when we were in that learning team with those workers, what we actually found was that 81% of those people felt that doing these things did not make them feel safer. What does that mean? Well, if you do something and you don't see the value in it, why would you carry on doing it? So in many situations, people were completing these things as a token part of it because they had to rather than they wanted to. Yet 40% of those people felt that pre-start was of benefit. And interestingly enough, 77% of people felt that pre-start was a one-way conversation. So what this identified was that their systems were a wasted learning opportunity. Now, what was the net result? Well, the net result was we need to do activities every day. And we need to have some activities that happen at the beginning of the day we need an activity that happens towards the end of the day, because how we plan work and how work evolves and how work is done is always going to be different. So we changed that process. They had a briefing in the morning, and that briefing was conversational based. So it was two ways. And that conversation wasn't about what are the hazards today. That conversation was a dynamic conversation about the types of situations they're going to encounter for that day. So it was really focused around dynamic risk. But what was more important, before they finished their shift for the day, that group got back together and they reflected on work as planned and work as done. And that information was captured in a concept of what we call basically, rather than what went well or what didn't go well, we captured that basically about how we had to make do. And the bits that we captured and how we had to make do, that fed into the next day. What was interesting is that when the organisation then looked at the improvements it made to that system was now taking half the time of the old system, but generated much better outcomes for the workers whilst meeting the compliance need of the organisation. The saving was $200,000. So I was asked the question, what would be 3 key values of learning teams? Everyone's got to be slightly different, but I just want to share with you 3 that I think can really relate to that sort of healthcare environment. The first one is that learning happens across both at a worker level, a work team level, and an organizational level. And when we think of learning, we think of it in very much in a single dimension. So what's really interesting here is what workers learn at an individual level, what the work team learn, how they work together, and what the organization learn is always going to be different. And that's an important part of it. And we talk about, rather than describing something as a learning culture, what we talk about learning teams is about creating a cultural practice of learning, so that learning becomes a way of how we do things around here. But it recognizes that learning at that work team and organization level, that workers can actually self-improve. And the system should improve by listening to what's being learnt at the work team and at the worker level. The second learning, which was really interesting, is that learning itself doesn't always need to lead to a system improvement. And I always have this interesting analogy. If you went and did an accident investigation and you spent a day doing the investigation and you came up with no corrective actions, how would the organisation feel about that? Well, in many cases, they'd say, so you spent a whole day and you've got no one single fix. With a learning team, what we learn and what needs to be improved at a system level don't always have to go hand in hand. Because the learning can even come from the fact that the workers who participate in that learning team, or the organizational leaders, the managers who are in that learning team, what they got to better understand was the purpose of the system and how the system supported workers in that way. So that learning would lead to a self-improvement of the individuals or the work team, but it doesn't need to lead to an improvement of the physical system itself. So we always separate the difference between a learning and whether it needs to lead to an improvement. And the third component, which I think is really interesting, is that learning from the weak signals. So learning from those everyday conversations, learning from those things that have that high frequency and similarity, learning from that can build resilience in both people and the systems they work in. And what we're seeing more and more and more is that not only do systems need to be resilient, and that is to have that capacity to cope, but as humans, we need to be able to reflect share, and that restorative nature of a learning team helps to build that resilience in ourselves as individuals as well. So two key takeaways to start your journey. This is really important because for many of us, starting learning teams feels quite scary. And the reason why it feels scary is that we're moving into what we call uncertainty. So one of the, I think, key values of a learning team is its organic nature of storytelling. But the problem with that as a facilitator, how do you start those conversations? Because for many of us, when we do things like accident investigations, we're simply following a process. Well, with a learning team, whilst we have a framework and we have a series of phases for a learning team, it's not a physical process. So it's that organic nature that can be quite scary. And what I suggest to people is have yourself a little bit of structure. And as you become more confident in how people share their stories, then that organic nature will grow. So the two takeaways are this. The first one is be curious more often. An example of that is ask people to share with you in a story when something didn't make sense to them, when something was harder than expected, when something was different from what it normally would be, or when something didn't feel right. Because what we're doing there is we're asking people to recall something. And we call that the 4 Ds. Dumb, difficult, different, and dangerous. So if you want a little bit of structure, then use the 4 Ds as an example to help give you that structure, but use the conversation organically. And I can tell you now, everyone can share with you a story when something didn't make sense, when something was difficult, when something was different, and when something was dangerous. And the second takeout for you as well is don't try and fix things. I understand that, part of this problem-solving skills that we've built up in the sector is the fact that we feel that we need to always action and fix things quickly. Many of the risks that we face, particularly risks around what we call psychosocial risks, risks around mental health, well-being, those types of things, I really question if they are fixable. So think about using learning teams to better understand. So rather than saying that we're out to fix something or to solve a problem, think about it from the point of view of using learning teams to better understand the problem itself. Because the better understanding of the problem leads to better outcomes. And those outcomes should be very much focused on both the people and the organisation. So look, I'd like to say thank you today for allowing me to participate in your conference and for me to share with you our learnings at the same time. I really hope that you can glimmer 1 or 2 things from you on your journey. And don't forget that you're part of a bigger community, and connect them with our podcast series as well at learningteamscommunity.com. I'm Brent Sutton. I've been very proud to work today with MediRisk and presenting this presentation to you.